Belgium says it regrets Rwanda's decision to cut off diplomatic ties, citing its unwillingness to hold dialogue to resolve their issues. Kigali announced its decision to cut relations with Brussels on Monday. It's accused the country of ongoing interference and unfriendly conduct. It's also given Belgian diplomats 48 hours to leave the country. Rwanda says the move is in response to Belgium's continued efforts to undermine the country, particularly amid the ongoing crisis in the DRC. Let's talk about it with international relations expert Ayesha Kajee. Ayesha, good morning to you and welcome to the program. If you look at the history of and the relationship between Brussels and Kigali, it is a story that's born in an 1884 moment. And especially when you think of the DRC aspect of all of this, we know that Germany, England and Belgium had agreed to reduce Rwanda's borders many years ago, annexing Rwandan territories to the Belgian Congo and Rwanda. So I'd really love for that to be the starting point of our discussion.
Well, as you said, yes, historically and during the colonial era, there was a, to say the least, tense relationship between Belgium and the rest of that part of the world, including what is now the DRC, including what is now the Republic of Congo, Burundi, and Rwanda itself, because Belgium was the colonizer in those days. However, since then, and specifically since the 1994 genocide, Rwanda and Belgium have had a fairly amicable relationship, as Rwanda has had with most of the European Union as well, because it sold itself as the success story post-genocide, as the economic success story, as the social success story. And in many ways, Rwanda has made considerable strides. However, it has become very much an autocracy. You have now President Kagame there, who's installed himself pretty much as president for life. There is, even since the early days, since when, I used to be a regular visitor to Kigali in the early to mid 2000s, and, up until about 2010. And increasingly, the freedom of voice, the freedom of expression was very much under threat then. So, you saw things like the Gacaca process, which started off as a true grassroots court, starting to be taken over by the government and then entirely engulfed by it. So everything that happens in Rwanda now happens very much at the behest of Mr. Kagame and his recent actions in the DRC. Look, he's always been it's been widely known that he's been supporting and arming the M23 rebel group. And initially, there was some justification for that. There was some justification for Rwandan troops to be in the DRC because many of the genocidaires from the 94 genocide had crossed over the border, fled over the border. But that justification no longer holds true. The M23 now is pretty much a Congolese outfit, but with Rwandan assistance and Rwandan army. Yeah. And it does have Rwandan troops on the ground, as the UN expert report late last year showed. And also very, very evident is that since the M23 took over large swathes of land last year, including the mines at Rubaya, Rwanda has been exporting certain minerals way beyond its own capacity to mine them and way beyond what its own resources are estimated to be. So there's little doubt that those minerals, including coltan, cobalt, tantalum, uranium, tin, and gold, are actually coming via the DRC, which is an infringement of the DRC's territorial sovereignty as well as its economic sovereignty.
You talked about the UN report, which stated, unequivocally that it is Kigali that controls the M23. We've heard repeatedly from Kagame denying that and saying it's not so, but Kagame is now accusing Belgium of advocating international sanctions for all of the reasons you've just talked about now against his country and the conflict in the DRC, which is why I thought it was so interesting that arc from the Berlin conference, what happened to Rwanda over the years. As you say, there was a working relationship between the countries, but coming back in this issue now, this fissure emanating from what's happening in the DRC. Rwanda, in that communique, saying, this decision reflects our commitment towards safeguarding our national interests and the dignity of Rwandans, as well as upholding the principles of peace, dignity, sovereignty, and mutual respect. Of course, Belgium has also responded. They've also expelled Rwandan diplomats from their country.
Yes.
So, from your perspective, how important a relationship is this for both countries, and what's likely to happen next?
Well, what is happening as we speak on the ground are the peace talks scheduled in Rwanda today, where there is for the first time going to be a direct meeting between Mr. Tshisekedi, the leader of the DRC, and the leaders of the M23. And I believe it is that more than anything which has probably angered Mr. Kagame, because he's no longer included in that as an intermediary. That's the one. Of course, the other thing that's angered him are the sanctions imposed by several Western European nations. But in the end, both Western Europe and Mr. Kagame will probably come back to the negotiating table, because Rwanda does actually have a treaty to support the EU in some of those mineral resources, and it needs to sell its own resources, let alone those emanating from the DRC. So they will come back to the negotiating table at some point. But we might see that in the short to medium term, the spat between Belgium and Rwanda continues. Remember also that the EU itself is based in Brussels, so that Belgium is a very important partner for Rwanda in that sense. And Mr. Kagame has traditionally and not unjustly played on the role Belgium played in the partition of Central Africa and making Rwanda the small, landlocked, perhaps at one stage economically dependent country it was post-genocide. So those sympathies will be played on again. Belgium did commit horrible atrocities in the entire region in the late 1800s and early 1900s. We should not forget that. But it's shown by its own expulsion of the Rwandan ambassador that it's not going to be held hostage by Mr. Kigali. Though, as I said earlier, I do believe that it will come to the negotiating table, at least in the medium term.
I know you misspoke, but Mr. Kigali, as you say, in the beginning,
Mr. Kagame,
styling or at least placing himself as a potential president for life in the country. And it's interesting when you look at that long history that you talked about. In fact, it's the opening sentence of that communique. Rwanda's decision has been taken after careful consideration of several events, all linked with Belgium's pitiful attempts to sustain its neo-colonial delusions, is what that says. Let's just talk about Kagame himself in this theatre of politics and support for him in this moment inside his own country.
Look, because there's so little freedom of expression inside Kigali, anybody who even disagrees with Mr. Kagame is generally disappeared or arrested or silenced in one way or another, or has to flee. And what is notable is that many Rwandans will not dare express any sentiment in opposition to the official line. There's an atmosphere of fear both in Kigali and in outlying towns and villages if you enter them. Even if you enter across the border, well, now it's a conflict border, but across the border from Rwanda into the area near Goma, near the lake there, there is people across Rwanda are afraid of the current administration in Kigali. They're not comfortable speaking their minds. One or two may speak off the record, but by and large, there appears to be a great deal of support within Rwanda for Mr. Kagame. I say appears to be because in the past, any real opposition, any real multi-party opposition has been quickly suppressed. And there hasn't really been any real contestation to the RPF. On the other hand, if you look at what's happening in the diaspora, some of Mr. Kagame's closest allies now living outside Rwanda have begun to criticize him quite severely. Among those is David Himbara, who was once based here in South Africa, or at least partially based here, now living in Canada. He's been quite critical of Mr. Kagame. But even those living in the diaspora are afraid because there have been known assassinations taking place outside the borders of Rwanda, of critics of the regime, including here in Johannesburg, Iman. So people are afraid, but there is criticism below the surface.
Ayesha Kajee, thank you very much. A disturbing but also fascinating look at this latest diplomatic spat between Rwanda and Belgium. We'll continue to watch the story as well.